go back to the climate of the 1580s, and the central culprit here, and to my mind, a giant figure casting an enormous shadow over the landscape of alchemy and modern science, is the Englishman John Dee. John Dee united in himself the complete spirit of the medieval magus and the complete spirit of the modern scientist. He invented the navigational instruments that allowed the conquest of the round earth. When Francis Drake sailed up the coast of California, he had navigational instruments that were top secret. The French, the Spanish must be kept away from this stuff, and these were navigational instruments created by John Dee that allowed him to locate himself anywhere on the globe. But John Dee was a man who, on a late summer evening in Mortlake, in his house in Mortlake outside London, the angel Gabriel descended into his garden and gave him what he called the show stone, S-H-E-W in Old English, the show stone. And the show stone exists to this day. You can see it in the British Museum. And what's amazing about it is it's a piece of polished obsidian. It's an Aztec mirror, is what it is. And there was a ruler of the Aztecs named Smoky Mirror. How John Dee got this thing, we cannot even imagine. I mean, he says he got it from an angel. Nobody can really say that. However, I suspect that Cortez, on his first return to Spain from the New World, he brought a number of objects with him that he had collected in central Mexico, and somehow John Dee got his hands on this thing, and it was for him a television screen into the Logos, and he used it over a number of years to direct the foreign policy of England. He was the confidant of Queen Elizabeth I, and he also was the most accomplished astrologer in Europe, and he used his ability to cast horoscopes as an entree into all the great houses of Europe, the kings and nobles of Europe. Well, he was functioning as an intelligence agent. He was a spy for the British Crown, insinuating himself into these various courtly scenes and then writing back to Elizabeth in ciphers that had previously only been used for magical purposes. He was sending back data on the strength of military garrisons and the placement of fortifications and this sort of thing. And but this was what he was doing in the 1580s. He kept the showstone for a number of years, and he didn't seem to be able to make much progress with it. He had other methods too. He had wax tables and sigils, but finally into his life came a very mysterious character named Edward Kelly. And some accounts say that Edward Kelly had no ears, which indicates that he had had his ears removed for being a charlatan and a mountebank. This was a common punishment in the provinces of England. So Edward Kelly was a very dubious character, I think. For one strong piece of evidence that he was a shady character was John Dee was married to a much younger woman named Anne Dee, who by all accounts was quite a beauty. And after gaining Dee's confidence as a scryer, the person who could look into the showstone and lay out these scenarios that the angels and the entities coming and going in the showstone were putting forth. Kelly revealed to Dee that the angels had instructed him to hit the hay with Anne. And this was a great crisis in their relationship. However, according to Dee's diary, and so it was done, we read. So, hanky-panky didn't begin with the Golden Dawn, believe me. In 1582, Anne Dee, John Dee, and Edward Kelly set out for Bohemia, and Rudolph, the Mad King of Bohemia, held sway at that time. Now, this is another one of these bizarre figures in the whole story of this. Rudolph collected dwarfs. He collected giants. He had what was called a Wunderkammer, a wonder cabinet. You see, before Linnaeus, before modern scientific classification, these great patrons of the arts and natural sciences, they would just collect weird stuff. And that was all you could say about it. I mean, it was rhinoceros horns, fossil ammonites, broken pieces of statues from antiquity, giant insects from southern India, seashells. All this stuff would just be thrown together in these Wunderkammer, these wonder cabinets. And Rudolph was a great patron of the arts. Well, Kelly sent the word that he and Dee had perfected the alchemical process, and Rudolph immediately paid their way to Prague and patronized them very lavishly over a number of months, but then they didn't seem to be coming through, and he ordered a castle put at their disposal in Bohemia, and they still weren't able to come through. The Voynich manuscript figures in here too, because Kelly's entree to Dee was that he had a manuscript in an unknown language. And I believe that this probably was the Voynich manuscript. The Voynich manuscript turns up in the estate of Rudolph, and the very month that he paid 14,000 gold ducats for it to persons unknown, Dee, who was always writing back to the Elizabethan court, hounding them to send money, entered in his account book that they received 14,000 gold ducats from an unknown source. Dee was able to talk himself out of this alchemical imprisonment, but not before he had written a book called The Hieroglyphic Monad. Now, you have to understand the importance of this. As late as the 1920s, in England, in the better schools of England, like Eton, when you studied geometry, you studied Euclid's works, and Euclid's geometry was always preceded by Dee's preface to Euclid. Until the 1920s, every English schoolchild studied this. He was a master mathematician as well as all these other things. This was how he was able to produce these navigation instruments. So Dee, while imprisoned in Bohemia, wrote a book called The Hieroglyphic Monad, in which he proposed to prove through a series of occult theorems that a certain diagram, which unfortunately I didn't bring the hieroglyphic monad, but it's basically the symbol of, the symbol of Mercury, which looks like the symbol for female, but you put horns on it, and then there were some adumbrations to that. By a series of theorems, he built up this hieroglyphic monad, and he initiated a couple of young men named Johann Andrei and Michael Meyer into the mysteries of the hieroglyphic monad. Well, then he was able to get out of Bohemia, and he went back to England. Kelly, who had made much more extravagant claims, Rudolph kept at work on the alchemical opus, and Kelly became more and more desperate to escape. And one night in 1587, he crept out on the parapet of this Bohemian castle, and a roof tile slipped beneath his feet, and he fell to his death. and became, so far as I can tell, alchemy's only true martyr. Well, Dee returned to England, and he was now very old, and he died at Mortlake in 1606. Elizabeth died in 1604. Shakespeare was happening. Sir Philip Sidney was happening through this period. John Dee reputedly had over 6,000 books in his library. He had more books than any man in England. He had books, we have a partial catalog of his library. He had books that do not exist now. He had Roger Bacon manuscripts, because you see, when Henry VIII kicked the Catholic Church out of England, the Northumbrian monasteries were looted by the Earl of Northumberland, and basically Dee was allowed to pick over the loot from these monasteries, and there were Roger Bacon manuscripts which perished when Dee's library was burned by an angry mob while he was on the continent, because he was suspected of being a wizard. He was the model for Faust in the later recensions of Faust. And whenever you see an old man with a white beard and a pointed cap, this image is really referent to Dee. Well, Elizabeth died in 1604, I believe, and James the First became King of England. And James was a peculiar character. The wags of the time liked to say, Elizabeth was king, and now James is queen. And not only that, he hated occultism. He had no patience with the whole magical court that Elizabeth had assembled around herself. Well, now, meanwhile, in 1606, a very mysterious document began to circulate in Europe and in England called the Fama. This is the first word of a string of Latin words, the Fama, and 2 years later, the Confessio. And what these were announcements that an alchemical brotherhood was seeking recruits. These are the primary documents of Rosicrucianism. Now, Rosicrucianism was based on a fiction and a fictional person, Christian Rosenkranz, who was imagined to have lived almost 200 years earlier, in the 1540s, and been a great alchemist. And it was claimed that his tomb had been recently opened, and that there were books inside it which set the stage for the alchemical revolution of the world. Notice how this occult mind always tries to reach back in time to give itself validity. So, and Christian Rosenkranz was claimed to be the author of a series of books, the chief of which is called The Chemical Wedding. What this was all about, I believe, and the Rosicrucian Enlightenment makes it fairly clear, was Dee, during the period when he had been in Bohemia, had set out to lay the groundwork for an alchemical revolution in Central Europe. And he had made Johann Andrei and Michael Meyer his agents in this plot. And it was a plot to meddle with European history and to turn the Protestant Reformation toward an alchemical completion. They felt that Luther and Huss and these people had only gone so far, and that the culmination of throwing off the yoke of the church would be the establishment of an alchemical kingdom in Central Europe. The target then of the attention of Michael Meyer and Johann Andrei and a number of these alchemists became the young he's called Frederick the Elector Palatine. He was a prince of the Northern League in Germany. He ruled in Heidelberg, And Heidelberg, as you know, is a 1,000-year-old university city, and I believe I mentioned that the alchemical press of Theodor de Bry was operating out of Heidelberg. Heidelberg became a magnet for all the occult thinking going on in Europe. And all the puffers and alchemists, the gold makers, the philosophers, the charlatans, they all converged on Heidelberg. And Andrei and Meyer were advisors of the young Frederick. And they steered him by a series of political manipulations, too complex to tell, toward a marriage with the daughter of James I of England, who was named Elizabeth, interestingly enough. So Frederick the Elector made Elizabeth, the son of James of England, his wife. Now, Frederick here made a serious miscalculation, because he thought that if James would give the hand of his daughter in marriage, that this was his way of blessing this alchemical conspiracy. Actually, what was on James's mind was he was about to give one of his sons in marriage to a Spanish princess of the Habsburg line, a Catholic. In other words, he was playing both sides against each other. He was not giving the green light to an alchemical revolution at all. But it was assumed so. Well, then in 16, 17, 18, Rudolph, remember Rudolph, the emperor? He finally dies at a very ripe old age. And at that time, the Protestant League, which was made up of these princes, of these small principalities scattered across Germany and Poland, they actually elected the emperor. It was not by right of primogeniture, but by election by what was called the Northern League, this group of princes. Frederick and his alchemical cohorts had done their political groundwork very, very skillfully, and they were able to engineer the election of Frederick to Emperor of the Empire. And he became Frederick the Elector Palatine of Bohemia. And this set the stage for an episode called the episode of the Winter King and Queen, one of the great after Nicholas and Pertinel Flamel, this is one of the great romantic stories of alchemy.